So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start. If I can ask you to turn off your cell phones to avoid any interruptions in the program. If you do not want your photo taken, please let the Board of Trade staff know. We do use photos for both internal and external publications. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Anita Huberman. I'm CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade, and welcome to this lunch. I can't believe it's September 10th already, and we are hosting our first fall lunch of the season. And I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of our Coast Salish people, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen First Nations. Events like this simply would not take place without sponsorship. Please help me thank our supporting sponsor, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. Our media sponsor, the Surrey Now Leader Media Group. And at the Surrey Board of Trade, we have a business and international trade center. So if you're starting a business, you need global connections, come and visit us at the Board of Trade's office where our business and international trade center is. And we couldn't have that center without the sponsorship of the law firm of Fasken, the accounting firm of PwC, and the Chambers of Commerce Group Insurance Plan represented by SNF Benefits. Let's give them a great round of applause. And our Board of Trade directors, they're responsible for the future vision of our organization, the future vision of this great city that we live in, right here in Surrey, British Columbia. We're going to be the largest city in BC in about 15 years. And I'd like to recognize our board chair, Doug Tennant of Unity. Dr. Greg Thomas, president of G3 Consulting and chair of our international trade team. Rory Morgan from Hamilton Duncan and chair of our transportation team. And Sasha Ranmarine of Remedios and Company. I don't think he's arrived just yet. Thank you so much for attending, my board directors. So ladies and gentlemen, you are here, you're supporting Surrey's business organization. We're a city building organization where we support business, bring business into our city. We're creating those great opportunities, not only locally, but also nationally and internationally. And that's what today's keynote is all about. And making sure that we have the supports to underscore the human capital that we need to ensure we have thriving industries. So this year, the Surrey Board of Trade, thanks to the BC government and a great funding support that they gave to us in February, we're going to be releasing the first ever Surrey labor market study and workforce strategy up until 2024 and beyond. It is funded by the BC Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction because this government has said that reducing poverty is part of their economic plan. It's part of their jobs plan. And that means making sure that we're tying industry needs to curriculum development and that we are looking at the cross spectrum of what we need to support our very diverse industry base right here in Surrey, British Columbia. So we have developed a Made in Surrey strategy that will establish a community-wide workforce skills council. And at the center of this will be a Surrey Employer Talent Innovation Lab. And it's so exciting. We're going to be talking more about it when we release the report on October 17th. So it's going to help prepare labor force participants in Surrey, including underutilized, marginalized talent, to connect with employers to increase our talent base. Because one of the top 10 competitiveness issues that we have in this country is skill shortage. And that has been an ever-present fact, especially for the last decade. And in Surrey, we're trying to get it right. And to tell you a little bit more about this leading edge report and also results-oriented strategy, please help me welcome to the stage our research director, Mr. Kerry Jothan.
Thanks very much, Anita, and good afternoon to everybody. As you heard, Surrey is the fastest growing city in Canada, not just BC, Canada, and will soon surpass Vancouver as the largest city in BC. It is also one of the most diverse and increasingly cosmopolitan communities in Canada. Little did I know when I grew up here and left 40 years ago that I would be standing in what in 40 years or 50 years would be the largest city. This was still country when I was here. But the economic and social well-being of Surrey will rely heavily on the capacity of its industries and employers to be innovative, productive, and competitive. In turn, this capacity will depend to a large degree on the ability of companies and the Surrey community as a whole to attract and retain the most skilled and engaged talent available. As some international business leaders said recently in what they called their new playbook, talent has never been more important to the success of a corporation. Talent is king. Talent, even more than strategy, is what creates value. The implications of this are profound. You must deploy talent as successfully as you deploy capital. So, this Surrey talent capacity will also depend on another important factor, and that is on supporting individuals in the labor force who are underemployed, unemployed, and otherwise marginalized, and facing barriers to education, training, and meaningful employment. This will depend on strong connections between Surrey's labor market demand and supply. That is, between employers like you and the talent that exists out there. Over the past several months, Anita alluded to the Made in Surrey Workforce Strategy, the first one ever. Central to this strategy will be the Surrey Board of Trade working with businesses and many others to enhance the community and business capacity for addressing workforce skills gaps. This includes, as Anita mentioned, a Surrey Employer Talent Innovation Lab that will bring together businesses, service providers, education and training institutions, and others in the Surrey workforce ecosystem to work collaboratively and in a coordinated way to deliver solutions on talent attraction and development. It will be led by a Surrey Workforce Development Council. You'll hear more about that later. The vision for this strategy is based on the fact that we believe Surrey will be a leader among communities embracing the new economy and a new future of work to produce great outcomes. So the vision is, in 2030, Surrey is an opportunity city with a livable space and quality of life to enable a growing economy and businesses that attract and retain highly motivated talent who choose to live, work, and play in their community. Surrey businesses are supported by an innovative and flexible workforce development system with a diversity and inclusion of sectors and talent working together. The goals of this are fourfold. One is that Surrey employers will have access to talent and talent development with the right competencies at the right time and in the right place to support growth. Secondly, a cohesive and coordinated world-class Surrey workforce development system involving responsive, flexible, and innovative education and training will be in place. Thirdly, Surrey has the reputation, the infrastructure, amenities, transportation, housing, services for families that will enable the community and employers to attract and retain the needed talent. And lastly, the Surrey community, businesses, and other employers and the workforce development system have the data with which to make informed, evidence-based decision-making on workforce priorities. And there are 7 workforce priorities, before I finish up, that this strategy will take action on. Attraction and retention of talent, of course, not just individual employers, but the community as a whole, because we're competing with many communities throughout BC and the world. Secondly, the K-12 and post-secondary education, student preparation and retention and connections with industries and employers, strengthening that. Thirdly, high-quality, job-specific, flexible, and innovative skills development aligned with industry needs. And fourthly, this is important, increased readiness and utilization of all talent pools in our workforce. The other priorities include the information and awareness, the collaboration, coordination, and building linkages across the myriad of organizations involved in workforce development in Surrey. And most importantly, advocacy and influencing to obtain government, political leadership, and community support for many improvements to Surrey that are needed to enable talent attraction and development. You'll hear more about this initiative from the Surrey Board of Trade before the strategy is formally launched in October. There are over 70 specific tactics in the strategy that you will then see. It's very concrete and very focused. Please let the Surrey Board of Trade know if you have any input on these topics. There's still time to inform the strategy before we finalize it later this month. We look forward to your creative ideas, your energy and passion, and your interest in being part of the implementation of this strategy. Lastly, I congratulate the Board of Directors of the Surrey Board of Trade, Anita Huberman and staff, and the members of the steering committee that oversaw this work for their leadership in overseeing and leading the development of the first ever Made in Surrey workforce strategy. So again, Surrey is leading the way. This strategy will be another example of that. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Carrie. And I'm really excited about this strategy because a third of our population is under the age of 19. Over half of our population has a mother tongue other than English. We are receiving the most newcomers, refugees into our city. And we have a very diverse industry base. We have the most number of manufacturers in British Columbia right here in Surrey. And we're a border city. We're in the middle of that Cascadia Innovation Corridor, really trying to bring business in, but also trying to try that human capital into all of those diverse industries. So many exciting things happening in our city and in our economy. And really, we're so excited also to welcome our keynote speaker from Alberta, right next door to our province. Today we're going to discuss the role that Canadian energy products play in the global economy and meeting our growing global energy needs, because we are on the international scale, no matter what anyone says. It is Energy Week, which is kicking off today in our nation. There are 2 focuses today, and I want you to think about any questions or comments that you may have after our keynote speaker has concluded. There is a microphone in the middle of the room. We're going to proceed to a bit of a sofa chat as well. And we're going to focus on how addressing energy poverty in many developing countries is really a focus for this nation. The second is an exploration of how Canadian producers can meet this global demand while playing a leadership role in reducing global emissions and fostering inclusive growth in Canada. We're going to hear about the technologies and practices that can help Canadian energy producers continue their decade-long successes in lowering emissions per barrel. So ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker this afternoon, he joined Athabasca Oil Corporation in November 2012 as their Senior Vice President, Light Oil. He was promoted to Chief Operating Officer in 2013 and President and CEO in 2015. He brings over 20 years of exploration and production expertise to Athabasca. Athabasca Oil Corporation is a Canadian energy company with a focused strategy on the development of thermal and light oil assets. They're situated in Alberta's Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. I'm originally from Alberta myself. The company has amassed a significant land base of extensive, high-quality resources. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our keynote speaker a great BC welcome, Mr. Rob Broen.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Anita. And it's my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to join you here today. And I just want to say congratulations for becoming the fastest growing city in Canada. I did not realize that, and I'm sure that takes a tremendous amount of work and effort. And congratulations to all of you. As Anita said, I am the CEO of Athabasca Oil Company, and we're an Alberta-based company. We have oil sands assets. We have assets that produce, and we drill and explore for conventional oil and gas as well. So we kind of cover the spectrum. I do feel like I have a pretty strong connection to BC. Two of my children go to university in BC at present, and it's looking like my youngest will go there as well. And so I hear a lot about the dialogue that at least happens on the campuses in British Columbia. So, as Anita mentioned, I'm here representing the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And we have launched Energy Week this week. And that's going to be a series of talks across this country to talk about our industry in Canada and how it fits on the global stage. And my hope is that this can help foster maybe a slightly different conversation than our industry has generated in the past. And perhaps before I begin, I would like to show you a short video. It's about 60 seconds long, and it kind of sets some context for some of the themes that I'm going to talk about.
Over the past decade, everyone from foreign-funded protesters to homegrown activists have attempted to landlock our resources. While we've been busy reducing GHG emissions and maintaining the highest environmental and human rights standards for energy development in the world. The world needs Canadian energy. It needs the most responsibly sourced and safely delivered energy. And clean energy for tomorrow needs responsible oil and gas development today. Energy drives our economy as much as it drives your car. We create jobs and build schools, playgrounds, and hospitals. We support communities, charities, and families. We fuel the arts, technology, renewables, and virtually every other industry. We will continue to employ millions, feed families, fund infrastructure, and fill restaurants, movie theaters, and hotels. We are Canadian Energy, and we are proud.
Great. So I am very proud to work in the Canadian oil and gas industry. I'm a proud Canadian, and I'm proud to stand here today to share with you how Canadian energy can play a huge role both in our economy and on the global stage in reducing emissions and making a better environment for the world. And so to kick it off, I just want to start with some of the basics. So first of all, where do we stand as a nation in terms of our production? So Canada is blessed with an abundance of natural resources. In fact, we have the third largest oil reserves in the world. And you can see on this graph that we're only behind Venezuela and Saudi Arabia on that particular statistic. Therefore, we're also a big producer of oil and gas, and we happen to be the sixth largest producer of oil in the world today, so we're certainly a force to be reckoned with on the world stage, only behind some very big oil-producing nations. And in fact, if we get our egress situation sorted out in Canada, and I'll speak to that, we could very well become right up there in the top 5 very quickly. But we don't just have oil in Canada, we also have natural gas. And in fact, we are the 5th largest natural gas producer in the world. And a little known stat is that we actually have enough resource in Canada to supply our demand for the next 300 years. We have a very, very big resource in Canada. And I'm very proud that Canada has that. Now, of course, having a resource like that, we also have a very big impact on the economy. And I'm not sure if people realize, but oil and natural gas is Canada's #1 export. In fact, we're 22% of all exports out of Canada. Our industry generates about $100 billion a year in revenue, and we have capital investment into the economy of about $40 billion a year. And in fact, that $40 billion a year used to be $80 billion a year a short 4 to 5 years ago. So investment has declined in Canada, but it's still a very large part of the economy. We're a very big engine in this economy in Canada. And of course, with that comes jobs. And energy jobs across Canada are across the country. Through our supply chain, our sector employs over 500,000 workers, and that's through 10,000 different businesses. And this is truly a Canadian industry. You can see on the map that the jobs aren't just in Alberta, they're across the nation. And in addition to the Canadian know-how and innovation that we have, we use our manufacturing industries, steel and concrete industries in our industry. So it truly is a national industry. And of course, in Canada, most of the resources are owned by the Crown. So we are a huge supplier of revenue to our governments. And in fact, our industry contributes about $7.5 billion a year into revenue into the government. And that is what funds things that we as Canadians all value. So it's your health care, it's your education, it's your social programs. It's an important part of the revenue for Canada. And Canada can play a huge role in not only the Canadian economy, but meeting the global demand around the world and addressing environmental and social issues. So I'd like to bridge into that. So just a step beyond some of the basics. So we have lots to be proud of in Canada. In fact, Canadians pioneered a lot of oil and gas technology right from the 1900s and continue to do that today. We continue to find ways to develop our resources better with less environmental impact. In fact, Canada's oil and gas industry is among the most responsibly produced in the world, and that matters a lot. And I'd like to share with you why. Energy demand is rising around the world, and Canada can have a big part of that. And let's share some visuals with you to demonstrate that. This first slide is from the Paris-based agency called the International Energy Agency. And according to their 2018 World Energy Outlook, global energy demand will continue to rise as countries like China, India, Southeast Asia, and other regions seek to grow their economies. And all forms of energy are going to be needed. And you can see that on this chart. It shows all forms of energy. But the fact is, by 2040, the estimates are that oil and natural gas will still supply 52% of the demand in the world. And that's even as renewables grow by 400% over that same time frame. Oil and gas demand is not going away in the world. We need all forms of energy. As an industry, we support all forms of energy. Now, I want to share with you a couple of visuals, and demand is really illustrated by these visuals. The first that I want to share with you is around the world, there's more than 1 billion people that live in energy scarcity and in poverty. So that is an important thing to consider as we think of others who enjoy energy abundance. And I show this slide just because it shows the extreme. So everybody knows who Leonardo DiCaprio is. He has been to Alberta many times. He is an opponent of our industry. But this is a picture of the yacht that he rented in 2014 to go see the World Cup with his friends. It's got 2 8,000 horsepower engines on it. It's got 2 helipads. And that is while he was in the midst of criticizing Canadians for what we do. In my opinion, hypocrisy has no part of this conversation. We need to talk about what the world really needs. And what you can provide by giving affordable modern sources of energy are agricultural productivity, the treatment of drinking water, the treatment of modern solid waste management, and your kids around the world can actually read at night. And that's something that we take for granted, literacy, and that's something that we can play a role in providing around the world. Energy improves lives, it's transformative. Now, this is a slide that I wanted to show that shows the correlation between human development fueled by energy. So this first column here shows some of the most developed countries in the world, and that includes Canada. And you can see that our life expectancy is high, 79 years. Our children are educated. We are an educated society, and we use a lot of energy. If you contrast that to other groups, and I'll just flip right down the line, the most developing nations in the world use the least amount of energy. They have much lower life expectancy, and their children are not as educated. There is a direct correlation to energy usage and availability to energy to those variables. The one that I didn't show on here is deaths by air pollution. In fact, the most deaths by air pollution happen in the far right-hand column. And that's because their source of energy tends to be wood, biomass, animal dung, and it's polluting to their air, and it's actually decreasing life expectancy. So it would be no surprise to you if I showed you this slide that says, where is this energy demand to 2040 going to come from? It's not coming from Canada. It's largely not coming from the United States either, or Europe. It is coming from developing nations around the world, countries that are looking for Canadian energy. They have a huge desire to attain the same human standards that we enjoy. It's going to take energy, and ideally energy in the cleanest forms. Now, stopping energy growth in Canada will not change that world demand. It will be supplied by other countries with poorer environmental standards than Canada currently has. So why Canadian energy? What role can we play? So Canada has the world's leading standards for protecting air, water, and land. And in fact, there was a recent Ipsos poll, a very recent poll that was done that surveyed all the importing energy countries in the world. There's 31 countries involved in this. Almost 30,000 people responded to the survey. Canada's number one. People want Canadian energy. We're viewed as innovative. We have high regulatory standards and high social standards, and our industry is taking action on emissions. The world wants our energy, and using more Canadian energy means a better global environment and a better Canada. Now, I just want to put things in context a little bit. So the greenhouse gas emissions in a global context, Canada contributes about 1.5% on the global scale. The upstream oil and gas industry is about 20% of that. The remainder is the end user. It's who's driving the cars, it's who's lighting their buildings, it's heat for your homes, it's air conditioning. And in fact, the oil sands is only 10% of our 1.5% emissions. So the oil sands is 0.15% of the world's emissions. Now, greenhouse gas, having said that, the oil sands industry in particular, and I know this firsthand, has worked very, very hard to reduce emissions. In fact, our emissions are down 21% since 2009, and our estimate is by 2030, our emissions through new technologies will decrease another 30%. And if the world had the same environmental standards that Canada currently has, emissions across the world would decrease by 23% tomorrow. So it just goes to show the type of energy that we have, that we can supply the world. And that, by the way, is the equivalent of removing 100 million cars off the road. It's significant. And in fact, displacing more polluting forms of energy like coal and other forms of energy, global emissions growth can be reduced by as much as Canada's total emissions today. The world needs Canadian energy. Now, technology and innovation plays a big role. And this slide is trying to illustrate some of that. As an industry, we've always looked forward. We're very committed to excellence, and we always will be. We've partnered with many firms in Canada to do things better. In fact, over half of Canada's investment in emissions reduction technology comes from the oil and gas industry itself. So far, there's been about 1,000 different technologies that have been generated out of Canada, and more than $1.4 billion invested in clean tech. In fact, the oil and natural gas industry in Canada invests more in clean tech than any other industry in Canada. And our regulatory system is very good. So Canada is governed by a very open, transparent, accessible system of regulation. And in fact, a study done by Worley Parsons on the world's different regulatory regimes, Canada's regulatory system is among the most stringent in the world, and it compares well with Australia and Norway. And that's before any new regulations came into play. Now, we're in BC, and I think I would be remiss to not talk about liquefied natural gas and the impact on this province. So LNG could be transformative both on a macro and a micro scale in Canada. and the world. So responsibly produced Canadian LNG could replace coal-fired power generation, and natural gas is 40 to 50% cleaner than coal. Natural gas derived from LNG could be used for home heating. It could be used for cooking in countries that rely on that coal, wood, or biomass. And depending how the international climate change framework continues to evolve, Canadian LNG could make an oversized contribution to the climate file. As a country, we need to be a player in this business. We need to get involved. It's better for the world. Now, what's it going to take to realize the potential that I'm trying to describe? I really feel strongly that Canadian energy can and should be a part of enabling an energy transformation. It can play a huge role in meeting the energy demand in the world while addressing some of the environmental and social issues that I described. Using more Canadian energy is going to meet a better environment, so let me tell you how we can realize this potential. First of all, we need market access. Getting our energy to customers outside of the United States is important. Getting our products to those developing countries like China and India, and getting full value for our resource. Today, we have one customer. 99% of our resource goes to the United States. And it's estimated that we are losing $10 to $15 billion per year in revenues. We sell our product at a discount, and that is hurting Canadians. If Canada wants to make a difference, we need some options. We need governments at all levels to support pipeline projects. And new markets for responsibly produced Canadian energy products help suppress carbon leakage. And carbon leakage is what I've been describing. It's when other less responsible suppliers meet the global energy demand without addressing greenhouse gas emissions. So Canada's oil and natural gas industry is serious about producing Canada's energy resources while reducing emissions. So where does this egress need to come? So I have a couple of slides here. This is first different oil projects that have been proposed in Canada over the last number of years. We are limited by egress, and in fact, I think it's pretty well known that in Alberta right now, the government has had to step in and curtail production. That's unheard of in a free market enterprise. And production is curtailed because we simply don't have egress. So they're trying to create a fair playing field for a system that's broken. There's been many proposed projects. All of them have the intent of getting Canadian products to world markets. A couple that I would point out first is the Energy East pipeline. So that's a pipeline that would take Canadian oil to the East Coast. Today, Eastern Canada imports over 500,000 barrels a day, almost $20 billion a year of foreign oil. That oil comes from the Middle East, it comes from Russia, it comes from countries that do not have the same environmental and social standards that we have in Canada. This project was canceled after 5 years of waiting for regulatory approval. In fact, the project had been planned for much longer than that. And it was canceled because of a lack of regulatory certainty. The rules changed too many times, and the companies just could not stand behind it any further. The TMX pipeline is one that is Trans Mountain Pipeline that's probably near and dear to your hearts in this room. This is a project that will twin the capacity of the existing Trans Mountain Pipeline. Our company has a vested interest in this. In fact, we're a contracted shipper on Trans Mountain Pipeline. That pipeline was built in the 1950s, and it's not had a significant leak. Pipelines are safe, and this project is designed to get Canadian oil to global markets. And it's critical to our economy, and it will provide energy for human life, as I've described. So if we don't supply our oil, it will come from other countries. Now, LNG has a similar tale. Now, this is a pretty busy slide, and what it's trying to show is where gas is produced and where it's going to. LNG, there's a huge growth in demand in the world for LNG. It displaces the high-emitting coal-fired electricity, particularly in China and India. There's numerous West Coast LNG projects that have been affected also by regulatory delays. The Kitimat LNG Canada and the associated Pacific Trail pipeline is an approved project, and I'm pretty excited to see that move forward. It does face potentially another reapplication through revised federal environmental regulations. That would be crippling to the project, and that would be a real setback for the people of BC and the people of Canada, and obviously the people in the world. So looking at where the oil or natural gas is going, energy should come from Canada. if the global environment is to benefit. It shouldn't come from Venezuela. It shouldn't come from Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, or Iran. Canada's not even in the game in this yet. Now, I do want to touch on Indigenous prosperity. So economic development is fundamental to self-determination of our Indigenous communities. Our industry has been a partner in that for decades, and that's going to continue into the future. There's a lot of misconceptions about our relationship between our industry and Indigenous people. In fact, 6% of the workers in our industry are Indigenous, and that, on average, is 4% in other industries. Oil sands companies alone spent through the supply chain to Indigenous-run companies in the years 2015 and 16 over $3 billion. And if you want to compare that, the federal government on an annual basis spends about $60 million with Indigenous companies. Like all Canadians, Indigenous people have lots of different views on resource development. Some are opposed and they're vocal about it, but many want to see growth. There's over 130 communities that generate revenue from oil and gas on their lands. There's multiple groups that want to today invest in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and many support LNG Canada. In fact, the Coastal GasLink pipeline received support from 100% of the Indigenous communities on the pipeline route. So reduced investment in the oil and natural gas sector is causing a negative impact on our Indigenous communities. And I would encourage governments and all Canadians to recognize that a competitive oil and gas industry presents a significant opportunity to Indigenous communities. Now, one slide on BC. Why does it matter so much to BC? Well, in BC, in 2017, the upstream oil and gas industry invested $4 billion in this province. BC produces 30% of Canada's natural gas. There's about 51,000 workers that are employed through the oil and gas industry. And in 2017 and 18, the BC government received about $500 million in revenue. And of course, that contributes to funding social programs, education, healthcare, et cetera. So BC has a tremendous natural gas resource base, a highly skilled workforce. It has a very stringent regulatory system and a commitment to environmental performance. And that is good for our business, and that's good for Canadians. My last slide is a message. And I guess what I'm trying to say is what we need now is a strong, united national voice. The benefits of a long-term vision for the Canadian oil and gas industry include many, many jobs, over 500,000 jobs for Canadians, billions of dollars investments into our economy, billions of dollars of revenue for our governments to fund social programs. It contributes to a net reduction in global emissions, and it supports the quality of life in emerging economies. So please consider this opportunity. We can increase our share of global energy and benefit both Canadians and the world. And as Canadians, I think we have to challenge myths and misconceptions. And I'm up here standing up for Canada and our industry. I'm proud of it, and I think we have a story to be proud of. Thank you very much.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the time for you to ask questions. There is a microphone in the middle of the room. I ask you to indicate your name, your company name, and your question or your comment very succinctly. So while you're approaching the microphone, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for your presentation. And of course, we'll be social mediaing it towards all of our contacts. But tell me about your perspective on the Paris Agreement and your industry's role in meeting those targets.
Sure. So just to put it in a global perspective, and I had this in the presentation, but Canada's contribution to global emissions is about 1.5%. And our industry is about 20% of that, and the oil sands in particular is 10%. The very best way that we can move towards meeting our climate commitments under the Paris Accord are to move projects forward like LNG Canada. And depending on how the global framework on providing a cleaner fuel to the world and getting offset credit for that, that is the best way to move the needle forward, because our emissions within Canada are just not that significant. So we need to provide a better, cleaner energy to the world and lower the global emissions, and that's really where Canada needs to be focused. So I guess, in my opinion, it's not stopping growth of Canada. We need to, of course, focus on better reduction in emissions in our industry, and we will across all industries, but it's also getting our innovation, our technology, our cleaner fuel to the rest of the world.
Any questions from the audience? Please.
Especially in the energy sector, and I've seen, some of the values drop quite a bit. What's the light at the end of the tunnel from your point of view?
Sure. So, yeah, it's been a very tough macro environment for the Canadian energy space in the last 4 to 5 years. And the reality is what's hitting us the hardest is the price that we get for the product that we produce. Canada's oil and gas trades at the highest discount in the world. And that obviously, when you're running a business and running a company, that impacts your revenue and that impacts your ability to invest. And that has manifested itself in devaluating companies. Capital is not supporting the Canadian industry. And I was telling this to a gentleman earlier, as a company, the things that we need to run a good, solid company is regulatory certainty and fiscal certainty. And what I just described for you is a lack of fiscal certainty because we have a lack of regulatory certainty. And we have not been able to build egress we've invested in our companies in projects on the anticipation of regulatory certainty to see projects get built and egress get built in Canada, and it hasn't happened. So having said that, I'm very optimistic that some of those problems are being resolved. We had the Canadian government purchase Trans Mountain Pipeline and show a resolve to get it built, and I think that's positive. And I think that's done after a lot of consultation, following a very stringent regulatory framework, certainly listening to the concerns of everybody on that. Industry was not looking for a government purchase of that pipeline. That is not something that industry wanted. It was the only path forward. And so I'm very optimistic and hopeful that that will get built in the time frame that has been promised. And there's a couple other pipeline projects on the way as well. So I guess what I'm saying is egress, opening up out of Canada and providing investors the certainty attracts capital back to Canada, and that helps the valuations of companies.
Hi, Robert. Thank you very much for joining us today. Greg Thomas. I'm past chair of the Surrey Board of Trade. I'm also an environmental scientist by training. You answered a lot of the question that I wanted to ask, but I get frustrated when I hear the narrative always coming around the pipeline or pipelines being an unsafe option. You in your role must get very frustrated as well when ultimately oil and gas has to get out. And as you've just said, the egress is so important. Could you maybe just speak to the audience here about the safety of a pipeline versus rail versus truck, et cetera, and moving forward in the future, the need for the pipelines to be built in order to be safe, ultimately, as opposed to those other options? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah, I agree. The last place that an oil company wants to put oil is in trucks to transport or on rail cars. There's inherent risk in that mode of transportation that probably goes without having to describe it. Pipelines have been around a long, long time, and if you look at the technology that's available in pipelines, from the engineering that goes into them, the metallurgical protection systems that are in place, the pressure detection systems, the leak detection systems, even from in my career over the last 25 or 27 years, it's been a steep improvement in the technology that's available. Having said that, pipelines historically have a very low failure rate, very low. And in fact, I'm not aware of the Trans Mountain Pipeline that was built in the 1950s ever having a significant leak. So I'm not going to stand here and say our industry isn't without risks. all industries have risks. There's far bigger risks in the construction industry or residential home building than there is in our industry. But I'm absolutely convinced, as a company, I want my oil on a pipeline, not on a rail car that has to deal with weather and, really an older mode of transportation. Pipelines are a safe, economical way to get oil to market.
Hi, Rob, and very informative session. My name is CJ Sidhu. I'm a financial advisor with Sun Life. Couple of quick questions. One is, you said that 99% of our exports of oil is going to USA. Can you explain a little bit why is that case and why we're not diversifying to other markets? And the second question is, again, the biggest issue in British Columbia is Trans Mountain Pipeline, that the local government will approve the LNG project, but they will put the roadblocks in the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And there's a lot of politics around it, and where that project stands right now. I know it's in the courts, but what do you see as the outcome? Thank you.
Sure. So your first question, 99% of our product ends up going to the United States. So there's really only a handful of pipelines that leave Canada and go to a different market. And the United States happens to be the end user right now. So refineries that are built in the Midwest, Chicago area, refineries that are on the Gulf Coast, and even some refineries in California really are built for the slate of crude oil that we produce. And the pipelines that exist today, that's where they take the crude oil. So when Canadians have no other options, suddenly you're at the, mercy I would call, of the end user. And when the end user is an American company, an American refiner, an American midstreamer that's buying our product, they're buying it at a discount price because they can, because we have no other option. And I think it's as simple as that. There's really no pipelines that get our product to our own coastlines to access other global markets, or get it to Eastern Canada so we can displace the import of oil in that market. So that's the crux of the problem, and I think all these pipeline projects that have been proposed are there to get access to the world markets, and that includes the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that project was initiated about 10 years ago. It's had a long history of consultation and route considerations, and I know the CEO of the company very well. I know he personally has been involved since the start, and I think it's a project that the federal government has stated publicly they support. And in fact, when the regulatory certainty wasn't there for a private enterprise like Trans Mountain to see it through, the government bought the company with the resolve to see the pipeline built. So right now, it has a regulatory approval. I'm sure you probably know that construction has started. There's still some different local permitting through municipalities, et cetera, that needs to happen, but that is moving on track. There is one roadblock, and you may have seen it, but there was a grant for leave of appeal that was given last week. I don't know what the outcome of that's going to be. Obviously, there will be another day in court. There's no injunction at present, so I believe that construction will continue through those appeals. I believe the federal government has, at least they're saying they have the resolve to build through that. I hope they do. And if that happens, that pipeline will be operational in 2022.
Hello, my name is Lorraine Brett. I live in New Westminster. I'm happy to be here today. I'm a realtor, but for the last nearly 40 years, I've been married to a miner, an explorer, so in British Columbia and around the world. And so I'm very attuned to the needs and the challenges of the extractive industries. What I'd like to know is what you believe about the First Nations people for whom the Trans Mountain Pipeline might be an issue. It seems there's a perception out there that there's a fair bit of resistance, but today I think you said something different. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, it would be very difficult for me to speak on behalf or know intimately the dialogue that's been happening on this specific project. But I can tell you in general that our industry has had strong relationships with Indigenous communities. And like all Canadians, everybody in this room has their own views on resource development and how it should be done. It does manifest itself when the project is in your backyard and affects you locally. And that requires a conversation, and that requires an understanding of the concerns and appropriate consideration for those concerns. So, and that's something that doesn't happen overnight. It happens after lots of conversations. At the end of the day, it is not necessarily a consensus. The regulatory system is designed to make sure that there's proper consultation, to make sure there's mitigating things that happen, to make sure that the First Nations or any communities that are impacted benefit from the project. I think that has taken place, and at the end of the day, there's been an approval. So there's always a difference of opinion, and the courts are there to kind of see that through. But in general, there is a lot of support from Indigenous communities for the work that we do. And I mentioned it, there's 130 communities that direct benefit from oil and gas revenue on their lands. There are multiple groups of First Nations, including First Nations in BC, that are looking to get an ownership stake in the project, not because they just want to control something, because they view it as good business and a good business opportunity. And I can tell you that our company has relationships with Indigenous-owned companies, and they're some of the best out there. And the oil sands industry would not spend $3 billion over a 2-year span with Indigenous companies if they were not well-run companies that can compete. And so I think there's a whole nother narrative on the relationships that we have, the support that we have, the consideration that we give each other, both the communities to the industry and industry back, that should allow industry to move forward and benefit the communities.
Yes, thank you, Surrey Board of Trade. Thank you for coming. My name is Anthony Ezafta, the founder of Canada-Africa Network. My question to you is, Canada is a beautiful country, doing everything responsibly, better than other people that are trading in Africa. How can this industry tap the opportunity in Africa, a population of 1.5 billion? So what's the strategy?
Yeah, that's a pretty big question. It's, you know, as a Canadian, so I have worked abroad. I've worked in different countries around the world, including the United States, and I've traveled for various projects around the world. Working on an international scale takes a different level of expertise in terms of understanding, you know, regulatory systems and economies and in different areas of the world. And my former company was very international, Talisman Energy. So I can only speak from my own situation as a medium-sized producer in Canada. We very much believe in the resource that we have here. It can compete anywhere in the world. It always has competed with the regulatory system and commercially, and that opens up opportunities in other places in the world. And I think we have to have our house in order here so that companies don't all leave. And you know, one of the biggest assets we have in our company, we purchased 2.5 years ago, and we purchased all of Statoil's oil sands assets in Alberta. And we viewed that as an opportunity. Well, they viewed that as not an uneconomic project, but one that had too much pressure specifically in Canada. And they're a global enterprise that works in Africa, as I'm sure you're aware, and other places in the world. And it's not because we have a poor environmental standard. It was the appetite to be in a dialogue in Canada that impacted that. So I don't know if I'm giving you a very straight answer to your question, to be honest, but I think being more of a global industry in Canada, getting our product to the global, to the rest of the world, will open up opportunities.
My name is Alan Moulton. I just want to thank first the Surrey Board of Trade, CAP, and yourself, Rob, for coming here and doing this. I think it's great. I'd like to approach it from a slightly different angle, which is the concern of people who are attempting to block the efforts of CAP and are developing our industry. And specifically, I'm thinking of non-Canadian organizations and associations that are funding protest groups and that sort of thing. And my question is, to what impact are they having, and how are you combating that?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a complicated question. So there's been a lot of very good work that is starting to, I guess you would say, expose some of the funding that's coming in that's been in opposition of Canadian industry. I think as an industry, we've probably done a poor job of advocating for ourselves. Over the last couple of decades, we've probably taken it for granted that we had the support of Canada and Canadians. And part of why I'm here today is I want to be able to talk about our industry and talk about the facts and talk about the contribution and have a dialogue. I think so Vivian Krause is an example of, she's a lady that has done a ton of research, and she's very credible, and she's really focused on facts. And if you haven't seen any of her research, I would encourage you to go look at it. But that's one person, and I think there needs to be understanding the sources of funding against the opposition needs to be exposed more. And I know it's big, and it comes from places outside of Canada, and Canada is an easy target. Canada is an easy place to oppose, stand up, protest, whatever you want to call it, both our industry and other industries. And Canada needs to stick up for our own industries and make decisions based on facts. I can tell you the Alberta government, the new leadership of the Alberta government has just launched an inquiry, a public inquiry. Because part of the problem is, for me to go and try to do a study and uncover this, well, I'll always be viewed as biased. And I think the Alberta government is trying to make a public, independent inquiry to bring some facts to the table so that there can be a real dialogue for Canadians to have.
Thank you. Welcome to British Columbia. I was just in your beautiful province this weekend in Edmonton. It's wonderful to be there and see BC products being sold at the market. Made me feel really good that we still have a good relationship. Anyway, my name is Susan Chambers, and I provide business-to-business lead generation and sales support. So I entirely understand that having one good client is not a very good business strategy, and two isn't enough either. However, China was identified as a second market, and I'd like to see us being treated fairly there, as we should everywhere. So what can we be doing now as a country? What strategically should we be doing now so that we are treated fairly, short-term and long-term? That's my question.
Sure. Well, I think you know, as a business person, and we need to establish relationships with you know, companies, whether they're national oil companies or companies that do business in foreign jurisdictions. And you have to establish a relationship to understand if you have a similar set of values, and you can actually and work together for a common goal. I can tell you our company has partnered with foreign enterprises. So for example, PetroChina was a company that we did a lot of business with early in our corporate life. And they have built a project in Alberta, and it was originally Athabasca Oil land. So there can be good business relationships that happen. I'm not going to comment on the social aspects of, you know, maybe a Canada relationship with China, for example. Right now, I'm not sure I'm the best to talk about that, but it has to be cognizant, and you know, we honor the rule of law in Canada, and we have a set of values that we have to uphold. So if we're going to do business with foreign entities in Canada, I think that's a standard that we have to have.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm a student at UBC. So we talked a lot today about the oil and gas industry and how it benefits our country and how it has the potential to benefit our world. But we didn't touch too much on the glaring PR problem that we as an industry seem to have. You know, public approval for pipeline extensions always seems to be relatively low, and especially on campus. For me, for example, as a student organizer, I find it very difficult to engage with the broader student body because there's so many negative connotations that the oil and gas industry has. Student activists are very eager to blame oil and gas for example, the issue of climate change. So my question is, how can we better communicate the industry's values and facts and improve the public image overall?
Yeah, that is a great question. And, I hear a little bit of that talking to my own children who, they go to UVic, actually. And particularly my daughter, when she'll ask questions on our industry, and I'll say, don't you read the news? And she says, well, I don't read the newspaper. So I'll read the Calgary Herald or the Globe and Mail or National Post, and that is foreign to her. And so we have to do a better job of connecting through the proper social media platforms. I think CAP is making a significant effort in that through its Energy Citizens platform and a lot of the other social media avenues that way. There is a ton of organizations now that have spun out of our industry that are focused on that very issue. And in fact, I went to a conference a couple weeks ago, and we heard from 27 different organizations, mostly younger people, that have started a organization where their whole mandate is to better communicate our industry and what it's doing. And so I can't sit here and describe all of those actions right now, but we support it all. We need it all, and we need to find ways to access the newer generation, use the proper media platforms. Putting an ad in the newspaper is doesn't work the way it would have worked 20 years ago. That's for sure. But I'll be honest. I think we feel like we're on our hind foot a little bit on that, and we're trying really hard to get on our front foot. And we would be very open and interested in engaging with whatever organizations you're part of, and in how to progress that dialogue as well.
So this will be the second to last question, because I'll get the last question. Sir?
Hi, good afternoon. Enjoyed your talk. So I'm Forrest Tittle. I'm the Dean of the School of Energy at BCIT, and I have a question that probably has an easy answer, but I've never heard it. With the shutdown or the cancellation of the Energy East pipeline and the realization that we need to get oil actually ideally going in two directions, why hasn't there been an effort to build a pipeline to Hudson's Bay and Manitoba or Ontario and then come out that side of the country?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have the right answer for you either, other than I'm aware of at least one group that is interested in that and is significantly looking at it. I think it probably has a lot to do with the port facilities and getting tankers in and out and things that I'm no expert on for sure. But I think that is another legitimate route, for Canada's crude, and it's something that needs to be looked at. You can see it takes a long, long time in Canada to build infrastructure and take projects forward. So I think that's probably a consideration as well. When there's been expectation that Energy East or Northern Gateway or TMX or Keystone XL are going to be built, you don't want to overbuild infrastructure either. So, but I do think that we're going to need multiple avenues, and that is a legitimate one as well. Now, there's a new piece of legislation in Canada called Bill C-69, and that's a whole new set of regulatory requirements that I would say our industry hasn't wrapped its mind around. And how do you get projects built under that new legislation? And I actually don't know any companies that are prepared to put one forward under that legislation. So it's complex. It's going to need some review, and I think that's creating some hesitation as well.
Okay, this is the last question from the audience.
My name's Trent. I'm with Desjardins Financial Advisor, common sense advocate, I guess. The energy debate's been driving me crazy over the last few years. So what I'm shocked that your industry hasn't done is, like as you've mentioned, defend yourself. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate. All you have to do is a couple commercials that say, this is how many tankers come in off the East Coast. 90% of the people I speak to have no idea that Canada imports oil, right? Go back to every pipeline that's been canceled and rack up that revenue year by year by year that Canada missed out on, and show that the debt would be paid off. You can just one page, 10 items of fact. No crap, no arguing, nothing. And just publicize that. Everybody write $1 billion check and away you go. So is it individual company-wise, you guys are scared to step up and do it on your own, or is it like, what's the hesitation?
Well, I can tell you there's no hesitation from my standpoint. I am very proud of the industry I work in and proud of our track record, and I would stand up in any audience and say the same thing. I think it's a matter of, so there has been quite a bit. You maybe haven't seen it, and Canada is quite a complex country to find the right markets to show that message. Showing that message in Alberta is of no use because the people there believe, right, and know, and it's such a huge part of the economy. But getting that message out to other markets is starting to happen. This video, by the way, that I just showed, it just was released a couple weeks ago. It's an effort to do that, and it's paid for by industry. And our company contributed to it. Lots of companies did. It's produced in French as well, which is another challenge that we have in Canada. So some of that stuff is starting to come out. I think Energy Citizens, if you go look at that, that's another place that you can hear that messaging and sign up. It gets a lot of hits. I'm kind of at a loss to explain why it's not more impactful.
I've seen all that stuff, and it's polite marketing, right? So it's all feel good, we create jobs and stuff, but really what the people need and the university students need to see, or what he needs to have, is saying, if you're so opposed to extra tankers off the BC coast, then why aren't you protesting in Eastern Canada? Because here's double the tankers, right? If you're so concerned about the environment, look at Saudi Arabia and the places we're buying oil from, right? And just post the facts. You don't have to spin it anyway. Just post it so that, because it's basically it's ignorance, right? The majority of the population in BC has no clue about what's happening in the industry. They really don't know that there's a differential of price that we're selling to the U.S., right? And if the environmental movement had you guys just standing up saying, you know what, you're right, it's so dangerous out there because Eastern Canada's had an oil spill every day of the week for the last 50 years, right? Oh no, wait, they haven't. Right? And then that just will eliminate so much of the crap that we hear on the radio out here. But just food for thought, because I'm an energy supporter, and I'm like, it just drives me nuts listening to people talk out here.
Those are great comments, and I don't have a silver bullet.
Well, Rob, I'm so pleased with the diversity and sophistication of the questions from the audience and the interest in the industry. It is a hot issue in our province, as you know. And my last question to you is, tell me a little bit about the skill shortage or human capital challenges that your industry is facing.
I think the challenge over the last 4 years has been the loss of skilled labor. And there's been a lot of layoffs. There's been over 100,000 people out of work because of everything that I described and the challenges that we've had and the lack of capital investment because of the corporate challenges that we've had. My own company, 4 years ago, we had about 500 staff. Today, we have 200. So, and my company would be representative of a typical company in Calgary. So that is the scale of what's happened. So now when we look forward, a legitimate concern is how do we get the skilled labor? We need to build big infrastructure and resume capital investment, responsible capital investment. And I think it's a legitimate concern. I think a lot of the workers that lost their jobs in Alberta have left the industry. They're in other places. I was describing earlier in one conversation that there's some new petrochemical projects being built in Fort Saskatchewan in central Alberta. And the challenge is, and the concern is, where are they going to get their workers? Well, they're going to get them from other oil and gas companies who are already very low and very bare bones. So it's a legitimate issue. It's one that our industry has to face, and we have to make sure that we rejuvenate, I guess, the skilled labor force that we always enjoyed in Canada, and I think it's possible.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I know you, the Alberta Chamber of Commerce is also doing amazing work in that space. So, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to really spread the message of what you heard today. We're going to be doing the same. And again, a round of applause to Rob, please. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have another 4 months left of 2019, and we have another 50 or so Surrey Board of Trade events. They're all at businessinsurrey.com. But just a reminder about a couple of things. Tomorrow is the nomination deadline for the Surrey Business Excellence Awards. The nomination form is, of course, on our website. Next Tuesday is our 13th Environment and Business Awards. with the infamous keynote speaker, Robert Kennedy Jr., where he's going to be speaking about environmental policy is good business and how to really enhance our clean technology industry here in Surrey. And I also wanted to let you know that in November we are also bringing Mr. Stephen Forbes to Surrey, British Columbia for our Innovation Awards. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending this afternoon. Thank you to our supporting sponsor, CAP. Of course, our Business and Trade Center sponsors, the law firm of Fasken, the accounting firm of PwC, and S&F Benefits, our Chamber of Commerce Group Insurance Plan. Make it a great business day and a great business week. Thank you.